The smell of leather and cold paper fills the room as my son, with a smile too practiced, says, "You're out of the $77 million, Mom." Still, I don't flinch. As the lawyer slides the folder across the table, the weight of his words feels like poison, thick in the air. While they all watch me, unaware of the truth hidden in plain sight, I open the folder, and the silence hits harder than any betrayal. That's when the game shifts. I'm not out, I'm just getting started. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanksgiving weekend used to mean warmth, noise, and too much food. This year, the Langford mansion felt refrigerated, light bouncing off the glass atrium, silver cutlery lined like surgical tools. My son's laughter drifted across the table, hollow and rehearsed. I could feel the audience forming before I even looked up. Evan always did love an audience. He tapped his champagne glass with the precision of a CEO calling order in a boardroom. The chatter softened. The pianist's notes hung midair. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. Clara leaned closer to him, a diamond glinting at her throat like punctuation. I watched her hand settle over his, possessive, polished, a gesture rehearsed for photographs. Before dessert, Evan began, his tone light, we've decided to share something with the family. We. That word landed first, deliberate, cruel in its symmetry. I felt the faintest pulse of amusement under my ribs. He'd practiced this. Probably in the mirror of my late husband's study. Probably while she watched and smiled. The cousins leaned in. Harold Bennett, my husband's oldest friend, looked confused but intrigued. Thomas Reed, our family lawyer, sat quietly at the far end, pretending to adjust his glasses. He knew this wasn't going to be a toast. Evan smiled that magazine-perfect smile he inherited from me, but learned to use like a weapon. After months of discussion, Clara and I have finalized the estate plan. He didn't look at me when he said it. He looked through me, like someone clearing a desk. I rested my hands on the linen napkin. That's quite an announcement for dessert. Clara's laughter rang high and bright. You know, Evan, he can't keep a secret. The room chuckled politely. Forks clinked. Evan took a slow sip of wine, then said, almost casually, "You're out of it, Mom." It was a clean incision. No hesitation, no tremor. He kept his eyes fixed on me as he added, "You'll be comfortable, of course. But the 77 million trust? It's for the next generation." The silence was immediate, heavy, and exquisite. Across the table, someone's spoon dropped against a plate. The pianist stopped mid-note. I could hear the distant hum of the kitchen staff, oblivious to the execution taking place one room over. Clara squeezed his hand, a queen finishing her move. I leaned back slightly. "Oh, darling," I said softly. "Are you sure about that?" His smile flickered, the first tremor. "I think it's for the best," he replied. "You've done enough. It's time to let the younger generation lead." Lead. That word? Again. Evan always wanted to lead, never to build. For a moment, I saw the little boy who once built towers out of my stock reports, who cried when the dog died, who told me he'd make me proud. Then the image dissolved, and what remained was this, a man sculpted by greed, with my blood in his veins and none of my restraint. I lifted my wine glass, the crystal cold between my fingers. "Well," I murmured, "to the next generation then." Everyone followed, awkwardly lifting their glasses. I sipped, slow and steady, and let the silence stretch until it felt like silk drawn over a blade. Harold cleared his throat. "Evan, your father—" Evan cut him off. "My father would have wanted this. Mother's been generous enough." The arrogance of it burned sweetly in my chest. My late husband hadn't built this empire. I had. Every share, every dividend, every strategic merger had my fingerprints on it. He'd been the face, I'd been the foundation. And now my son, my perfect reflection, was dismantling it in front of me like a child kicking apart his own toy. I didn't flinch. I didn't need to. Clara tilted her glass toward me, her voice honeyed. We do hope you understand. You'll always have a home here. I smiled at her. Oh, Clara, I've never been homeless. For a brief moment, her eyes faltered, a hairline crack behind the gloss. She turned away first. Evan checked his watch, already dismissing me from his conscience. We'll meet with Thomas on Monday to finalize everything, he said, as though it were a board meeting and not a betrayal. Monday, I repeated. How efficient of you. He nodded, mistaking my calm for surrender. I set my glass down, folded my napkin neatly, and rose from the table. The motion was slow, deliberate. Every eye followed. If you'll excuse me, I said. Suddenly, I've lost my appetite. The click of my heels against marble echoed through the atrium as I walked away. Behind me, their laughter resumed, forced, uncertain, filling the silence like cheap perfume. At the doorway, I paused and looked back just once. Evan was already refilling his glass. Clara whispered something in his ear that made him smile again. Good. Let them. They thought the execution was over. They had no idea the body on the floor was only pretending to be dead. From the hallway, I heard the faint clink of crystal and Clara's voice saying, "To new beginnings." The sound floated after me like static, brittle, bright, and meaningless. Somewhere, someone laughed too loudly as if volume could hide guilt. I didn't turn back. The house stretched ahead of me in silence, each hallway echoing memories I'd rather not revisit. The portraits on the walls, my husband shaking hands with senators, Evan as a boy in his prep school uniform, watched me pass like witnesses. They'd all been painted to project permanence. Now, under the recessed lighting, they just looked smug. The study door clicked shut behind me, sealing out the sound of celebration. I stood still for a moment, letting the quiet settle. This room smelled the same as always. Leather, dust, and a hint of the cedar we used to burn in the winter fireplace. My husband had claimed this space as his domain, but I'd always known its secrets better than he did. The floorboards creaked as I crossed to the bookshelf. I pressed the latch hidden behind the intelligent investor. A soft click, and the panel eased open. The safe crouched behind it. Black, unmarked, perfectly ordinary. My fingers moved through the combination without hesitation. The dial turned like muscle memory, like piano keys I'd practiced in secret. When the door swung open, the air that escaped was dry and faintly metallic. 2 flash drives, a sealed envelope, a signed letter. The flash drives were labeled in my handwriting, equity and contingency. The envelope, ivory and heavy, carried my husband's name in bold script. The letter was my own, written 3 years ago in the middle of a sleepless night. I'd kept it here as insurance. Against sentiment, against stupidity, against my son. I laid them on the desk in a neat row, the lamplight touching each one like a blessing and a warning. You built this on my money, not his, I whispered. The words surprised me with their steadiness. In the reflection of the window, I saw a woman who looked nothing like a victim. Sharp lines, calm eyes, no tremor in the hand that had just lost $77 million. Outside, the night stretched wide over Dallas. Distant traffic, a siren, a neighbor's laughter. The world kept moving, perfectly indifferent. I sat in the leather chair and unfolded the letter from the bottom of the pile. My handwriting had thinned with age, but the message hadn't softened. If he ever turns the company against you, use the clause. Reed knows what to do. Thomas Reed. Loyal, meticulous, allergic to corruption, one of the last of his kind. My husband had trusted him, and I had tested him. He'd passed both. I reached for the phone on the desk, then stopped. My hand hovered over it, suspended between restraint and impulse. Once I made that call, there'd be no pretending the wound could heal on its own. In the hallway beyond the door, the laughter was fading. A glass broke. Clara's voice, tight, annoyed, followed by Evan's low murmur trying to smooth it over. The soundtrack of their marriage. I smiled, faintly. They thought tonight was their victory. They didn't realize it was the first chapter of their audit. My thumb hovered over Thomas's number. I could almost hear his voice already. Careful, formal, always a step ahead. "Are you certain, Mrs. Langford?" "Certain." I'd been certain for years. I'd just hoped for a reason not to be. I pressed the call button. The line clicked twice before his voice came through, groggy but alert. "Maggie? Is everything all right?" "I need you to come by tomorrow," I said. My tone surprised me. Level, almost detached. "We need to activate my clause." A pause. The rustle of papers. The sound of a man remembering old conversations he'd hoped would stay hypothetical. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. He left me no choice. "Then I'll prepare the documents." When I hung up, the silence felt heavier than before, but steadier too. The decision was no longer a possibility. It was a fact. I slipped the flash drives into my handbag, resealed the safe, and closed the panel behind the books. Everything looked untouched, just as it had that morning. Before leaving, I stood at the window again. The glass reflected both the city lights and the woman I had become. Composed, unyielding, quietly furious. Somewhere behind me, I imagined Evan pouring another drink, convincing himself he'd won. Let him. He would sleep soundly tonight, confident his mother was beaten. And tomorrow, when the lawyer's office door closed behind us, he'd learn that betrayal comes with paperwork, and that some clauses were written not in ink, but in blood. The next morning arrived gray and thin, sunlight filtering through the blinds like diluted truth. I'd barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the gleam of Clara's bracelet catching the chandelier light, the signal of triumph she didn't earn. By 9, I was in my car, the one Evan had once teased me for still driving myself. "Hire someone, Mom," he'd said. "You look like a widow in denial." He wasn't wrong, but sometimes, denial is just discipline. Thomas Reed's office sat on the 12th floor of a modest brick building in downtown Dallas. Not flashy, not fashionable, trustworthy. The kind of place where deals still happened on handshakes, and coffee was poured without being ordered. When I stepped inside, the receptionist startled. "Mrs. Langford, Mr. Reed said to send you right in." Thomas stood as I entered, his glasses low on his nose, tie slightly askew as though the morning had been rearranged by my call. His expression was halfway between concern and calculation. "Maggie," he said quietly. "I hoped I misheard you last night." "You didn't." I set my bag on the table, withdrew the envelope and one of the flash drives. "It's time." He hesitated before sitting. "You really want to trigger that amendment?" The way he said that told me he'd hoped it would stay buried. He was a man who understood the violence hidden in paperwork. I nodded once. He left me no choice. Thomas exhaled through his nose, long and weary. "All right, let's revisit it, to be sure we're aligned." He unlocked a file drawer, pulled out a folder so old it looked sun-faded. The tabs were handwritten in my late husband's precise lettering. When he opened it, the scent of old paper and ink filled the air. "Your husband added this clause 15 years ago," he said. "A contingency you both discussed at the time. His words, not mine. If any direct heir attempts to remove my spouse from controlling interest or inheritance, said heir shall forfeit all rights, financial or otherwise, to the estate and trust. His eyes lifted to mine. He never told Evan it existed. Of course not, I said. He trusted I'd know when to use it. Thomas leaned back. You realize what happens if we execute this? Evan and Clara lose everything. You'd become sole trustee. It'll be ugly. Ugly has already arrived, I said. He smiled faintly. Fair enough. The memory of the conversation that birthed that clause flickered behind my eyes. I could still hear my husband's voice, slower, softer, the sound of a man both proud and wary. He's ambitious, Maggie. Too much of you in him. Then protect me from myself, I'd replied. We'd been sitting on this very document when he'd said it, sunlight striping his desk. He'd slipped the amendment into the folder and kissed the back of my hand. If he ever tries to take it all, you'll have the power to teach him what it cost. Now, years later, that power felt less like vengeance and more like anatomy. A heartbeat resuming after a long pause. Thomas cleared his throat. They'll call an emergency meeting once this surfaces. Evan will claim ignorance. Clara will claim manipulation. It'll get theatrical. I smiled at that word. Good. Let them perform. I'm giving them a stage. He tilted his head. You intend to confront them publicly? Not a confrontation, I corrected. A demonstration. He blinked, processing. At the formal reading? Yes. Monday. I want you to invite them, along with Harold Bennett. Make it official. Cameras optional, but whispers mandatory. Thomas rubbed his temple. You want the performance of legitimacy. I want them to hang themselves with their own arrogance, I said evenly, and for that, they need rope. He closed the file and sat back, watching me like someone reevaluating a painting they'd always underestimated. You've had this planned a long time, haven't you? I smiled faintly. I've had it ready. There's a difference. He nodded, almost in respect. Then I'll prepare the schedule. We'll make it look routine, just another procedural review. Perfect. I stood, smoothing my coat. Routine is the best disguise for retribution. At the door, he hesitated. Maggie. When this is over, what happens to Evan? I looked past him, to the window overlooking the Dallas skyline. The city glittered, sharp, indifferent, metallic. That depends on how loud he wants his downfall to be. He didn't press further. As I left, the receptionist offered me a polite smile, unaware she'd just witnessed the opening act of a war. Outside, the air was colder than it had been when I'd arrived. A northern wind cut through the streets, snapping flags and stirring dust. I pulled my coat tighter, feeling the weight of the flash drive in my pocket. A small object carrying the ruin of 2 lives. At the crosswalk, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Evan. Lunch today? Thought we could clear the air. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then typed one word back. Monday. And as the light turned green, I crossed the street smiling, the city wind catching my hair like a curtain rising on the next act. Breakfast in the Langford mansion was never about food. It was ceremony. Silver trays, monogram napkins, and an undercurrent of politics disguised as hospitality. Clara sat at the head of the table now, the place my husband once occupied. Evan scrolled through his phone beside her, murmuring to himself about Monday's meeting, as though it were routine. They had convinced themselves the performance was already over. The staff moved carefully, eyes down. No one wanted to take sides. In this house, neutrality was survival. Clara buttered her toast with surgical precision. I've been thinking, she said, the tone of someone about to issue an edict. It might be good for your mother to have some time to adjust. Less pressure, fewer reminders. I'll have the staff move her things into the guest house. Evan didn't look up. That's fine. Whatever keeps things calm. I smiled into my coffee. Just make sure you lock it well. Privacy's important. Clara blinked, surprised by my cooperation. Of course, she said smoothly. We'll have it all arranged by this evening. Across the table, sunlight caught the rim of her teacup, the same porcelain I'd chosen years ago. Now it gleamed in her hands like a stolen crown. Lovely, I said, standing. I have a few files I'd like to organize before the move. Nostalgia, you know. Neither of them looked up. They thought they were winning. Upstairs, the air was still thick with the perfume from last night's dinner, roses and expensive gilt. I closed the door to my office and turned the lock. The flash drive labeled Equity waited on the desk beside my laptop. Its twin, Contingency, was already in my handbag, ready for Monday's performance. I slid the drive into the port and began copying the folders. Investment statements, transfer memos, digital receipts that mapped out 20 years of reinvested dividends. Proof that half the company's empire had been built with funds I'd generated independently, long before Evan knew the word stock. The progress bar crept forward. 40%, 60, 90, done. Outside, I heard the muffled footsteps of house staff, boxes being assembled, drawers opening and closing. Clara's efficiency was her favorite weapon. She always mistook motion for control. A soft knock sounded at the door. Come in, I said. Nina stepped inside, petite, quiet, loyal. My goddaughter and, lately, my only ally. She closed the door behind her with care. They're moving fast, she whispered. Clara's telling the staff to clear out your files. Good, I said. Let her think she's catching me off guard. Nina's brow furrowed. You sure about this? I looked up from the computer. Completely. Bait only works if the fish think they found it themselves. Nina exhaled, half smiling. You always did love a long game. It's the only kind worth playing. She handed me a small leather folder. Inside were the financial ledgers she'd retrieved from storage, handwritten notes, old transaction logs showing how much of the initial investment had come from my personal accounts. Proof enough to collapse Evan's narrative of inheritance. These were in the archives, she said. I think Clara noticed me taking them. She was supposed to. I slid the papers into a plain manila envelope and set it on the corner of the desk. Bait in its most elegant form. Moments later, as if on cue, the door creaked open without a knock. Clara stepped inside, smile thin as wire. Oh, there you are. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, I said pleasantly. Just sorting through old memories. Her eyes flicked to the envelope. I can have the staff take those down for you. We'll make sure everything's safe in the guest house. I leaned back in my chair. How thoughtful. Just be careful. Some things in there are quite fragile. She hesitated only a second before picking it up. I'll handle them myself, she said, already turning toward the door. When she left, Nina and I exchanged a glance. She took it, Nina whispered. Exactly as planned. I watched the door close, listening to Clara's heels recede down the hallway. My smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. Tomorrow, I murmured, more to myself than to Nina, she'll show Evan exactly what she thinks she's discovered. And when she does? Nina asked. I reached for the flash drive, slipping it into my blazer pocket. Then we'll let them build their story. Every good lie needs evidence. I'm just giving them mine. Outside, I could hear the faint rumble of thunder, the first storm of the season rolling over Dallas. I walked to the window, watching the clouds swallow the light, and said quietly, let them move me into the guest house. I've always done my best work from exile. Behind me, the computer screen went dark, the final files safely stored. By tonight, Clara would believe she'd found something worth using. By Monday, she'd realize she'd walked straight into discovery. And when that moment came, I'd be ready. Not with rage, but with receipts. By Sunday night, the Langford mansion had gone eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives when everyone believes they've already won. Rain tapped lightly against the windows, soft and rhythmic, as if the storm were rehearsing its lines before the real performance. Evan had locked himself in his office since afternoon, pacing, muttering into the phone. I'd seen him through the window earlier, sleeves rolled up, jaw set, ambition dripping off him like sweat. He thought he was tying up loose ends. He didn't realize he was already tangled. I spent the evening in the guest house, sipping tea and pretending to read. The files I needed were secured, the flash drive labeled contingency resting in my handbag. Every piece was in place. All that remained was for Evan to make his predictable mistake. And right on cue, he did. At 9:47 p.m., while the rest of the house slept, a black SUV idled 2 blocks away from Thomas Reed's office downtown. Inside, Evan sat in the passenger seat, tapping his knee impatiently. The man beside him, a junior clerk from the firm, jittery and underpaid, fumbled with the building's keycard. "You're sure this is the right drawer?" Evan asked, voice low but steady. The clerk nodded. "Top cabinet, right side, the Langford files. I just—" Evan slipped an envelope thick with cash into the man's coat pocket. "You didn't just anything. You're helping the rightful heir ensure the transition goes smoothly. That's all." He smiled, the kind of smile that came from entitlement rather than confidence. Minutes later, the two of them stood in the dim light of the office, the hum of the HVAC filling the silence. The clerk opened the cabinet and pulled out a labeled folder. Langford Estate. Amendment files. Evan flipped through the pages, scanning the legal jargon he barely understood. "This is her copy?" "Yes, sir. Original, notarized. She'll see it tomorrow morning." Evan removed a second folder from his coat. Identical in color and weight, but filled with blank pages. "Then she'll see this instead." The swap was seamless. He shut the cabinet, smoothed his jacket, and turned toward the window overlooking the city lights. His reflection looked like victory. "She won't even see it coming," he murmured. The clerk hesitated. "You're sure this is legal?" Evan's laugh was short and cold. "Legal. Please. Everything's legal when you can afford the lawyer." He handed the keycard back. "Lock it up. And remember, you've never seen me." By the time he returned home, the rain had thickened into a steady pour. He moved quietly through the hallways, shoes leaving faint wet marks on the marble. Clara was waiting in the darkened living room, wrapped in a robe, glass of wine in hand. "Well?" she asked. "It's done," he said, pulling her into a kiss that tasted more like relief than passion. "Tomorrow she'll open that folder and realize the amendment doesn't exist. No clause. No safety net." Clara smiled against his shoulder. "You really are your father's son." He smirked. "No, I'm better." But while he whispered promises of triumph, Nina's phone buzzed in her pocket on the other side of town. She was in her small apartment, surrounded by stacks of Maggie's backup files, cross-checking every version against the firm's registry. Something didn't line up. A timestamp had changed. A file that had been last accessed 5 years ago was suddenly edited tonight. Her heart sank. She grabbed her phone, typing fast. "Nina." He tampered with the file. The message sent at 11:32 p.m. Back at the guest house, my phone lit up beside the teacup. I read the text once, slowly, and smiled. "Maggie. Perfect. Let him." I rose from my chair, crossing to the writing desk by the window. The original folder, the true one, rested under a stack of financial statements. I opened it, flipped through the papers, then reached for an identical folder from my briefcase. This one contained Evan's forgery, The blank pages he'd risked everything to create. With careful precision, I switched them. My version, the decoy, would go to Thomas's office first thing in the morning, just as Evan expected. I sealed the real amendment in a smaller envelope, slid it into the false bottom of my leather handbag, and fastened the clasp. Outside, lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the rain-slick lawn between the mansion and the guest house. For a fleeting moment, I saw Evan's silhouette through his office window, pacing again, anxious, convinced he'd just secured control. I whispered to the storm, "Keep thinking that, darling." The wind howled in response, shaking the glass. Tomorrow, he'd walk into that conference room with every ounce of confidence money could buy. And in front of witnesses, he'd hand the lawyer a file he believed to be my undoing. Only then would he realize it wasn't my file at all. It was his forgery, notarized under his name, time-stamped with his access credentials. Evidence, not protection. I closed the curtains and sat back down, calm and deliberate, the hum of thunder wrapping the night like applause. The stage was set. And in the morning, I'd simply watch my son hang himself with the rope he thought he'd stolen from me. Monday morning broke with the kind of Texas light that flatters no one, pale, merciless, exact. I dressed deliberately, nothing extravagant, charcoal gray, pearl earrings, the same shoes I'd worn to my husband's memorial, a quiet uniform of control. By 8:30, the car was waiting. Nina stood by the door, handing me the leather handbag with its hidden weight. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "About what?" "About watching him burn and pretending it doesn't hurt." I looked at her for a long moment. "I learned a long time ago, Nina. If you can't stop the fire, control the oxygen." She nodded, understanding more than I said. Downtown Dallas hummed with weekday indifference. The Langford name still carried enough weight that the receptionist at Reed and Associates greeted us with a polished smile and slightly trembling hands. The air smelled of paper, cologne, and quiet anticipation. Thomas's conference room waited at the end of the hall. Mahogany table, leather chairs, sunlight cutting stripes across the floor. I'd always liked that room. It felt like a place where truth had to fit inside margins. Evan and Clara were already there when I entered. Evan stood as if the gesture might earn him points. Clara stayed seated, legs crossed, her lipstick the color of arrogance. "Mother," Evan said smoothly, "thank you for coming." "I had nothing else on my schedule," I replied. Thomas looked up from his papers. His face was carefully neutral, though I caught the faintest twitch near his mouth. The kind of tell only someone who'd known him 20 years would notice. He knew the current had shifted. "Shall we begin?" he asked, settling behind the desk. Clara reached for Evan's hand under the table. She didn't notice the pen trembling between her fingers. Thomas opened the folder. The decoy folder Evan had ensured was blank. "Per Mr. Langford's last amendment," he began, "we are here to finalize the terms of the family trust." Evan leaned back, projecting authority. "We've reviewed this already," he interrupted, voice light, confident. I tilted my head slightly. "Really? That's strange. This is the first time it's been unsealed." The smallest flicker crossed Thomas's eyes. Not confusion, exactly, but awareness. He looked down again, flipping 1, 2, 3 pages. Then he stopped. His brows knit. "There's something off here," he murmured. Evan's tone sharpened. "Off? What do you mean off?" Thomas adjusted his glasses. "These pages, they're blank." Clara's laugh came too quickly. "Blank? That can't be right. She cut herself off, glancing at Evan. I folded my hands in my lap, watching the performance unfold. Evan cleared his throat. "Well, perhaps the copies were misfiled. You can check with your clerk." Thomas turned a page slowly, deliberately. "This isn't a filing error, Mr. Langford. The file's been accessed recently. The seal's been broken. The word seal landed like a dropped glass. I said nothing. Silence, I've learned, does the work of confession. Evan's voice strained. Mother, you can't seriously think. I raised a hand gently, cutting him off. I don't think anything, dear. I'm just listening. Clara leaned forward. Thomas? Surely there's another copy? There is, Thomas said. Two, in fact. One in the firm's archive, another in the county records office. Evan's jaw tightened. He didn't like variables he couldn't pay off. Thomas glanced at me, seeking a cue. I gave him the smallest nod. I'll fetch the archive copy, he said, standing, if you'll all wait here. The door shut behind him with a sound like a closing vault. Evan stood abruptly, pacing. This is ridiculous. The man's getting senile. I should have handled this myself. Clara whispered something sharp. I caught only the words too soon and calmed down. I rose from my seat, walked slowly to the window. Dallas glittered below. Glass towers and blue haze, the illusion of order. In the reflection, I saw Evan's face behind me, pale, sweating, trapped between bravado and realization. He said, almost to himself, "She must have switched it." I turned, meeting his eyes. "You really think I'd bother with paper tricks, Evan?" The lie tasted clean, even righteous. Before he could answer, the door opened again. Thomas returned, holding a thinner folder. The real amendment. He placed it on the table, unopened. I suggest, he said carefully, we continue in full when everyone's present. Evan's gaze darted to the folder, then to me. What's in that? I smiled, sitting back down. You'll find out soon enough. Thomas straightened his tie. We'll reconvene in 10 minutes. I just need to make a call. When he left again, the air in the room thickened. Clara stared at the closed folder as if it might detonate. Evan's hand twitched toward it, then stopped. I poured myself a glass of water, the sound of it steady, unhurried. You look nervous, darling, I said softly. Is there something you'd like to tell me before the lawyer returns? He forced a laugh. Please, you've already decided what you want to believe. I met his gaze and smiled. The same calm smile I'd worn the night he was born, the one he'd never learned to read. Not yet, but I'm very close. The ticking clock on the wall grew louder, and when Thomas returned, he wasn't alone. A young associate followed, carrying a small recorder and a witness affidavit. Evan's knuckles whitened around his chair. Clara's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the polished floor. The sound echoed like a gunshot. And for the first time, Evan Langford looked afraid. Thomas returned with the same composure surgeons wear before making the first incision. The young associate followed him, carrying the recorder and a fresh notepad. Rain rattled faintly against the tall windows behind us. Even the city outside seemed to be holding its breath. Let's resume, Thomas said, his tone neutral but firm. He set the thinner folder in front of him and looked first at me, then at Evan. I'd like to clarify the matter of this blank amendment before we proceed. Evan gave a dismissive half-smile. There's nothing to clarify. Clearly your office made an error. Thomas didn't blink. We keep dual custody of all estate documents, physical and digital. Each access is logged. Would you mind explaining why your credentials appear on the file timestamp from last night? Evan froze. The silence afterward was exquisite. Clara's hand tightened around her wineglass stem. That can't be right. Evan wasn't... I didn't... Evan stammered, then caught himself. He straightened his tie, exhaling sharply. Look, I may have reviewed the file, out of caution. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar estate. I wanted to be prepared. Thomas nodded slowly, pen tapping the table. Prepared? For what exactly? Evan leaned forward. the salesman in him reviving on instinct. You know how these things go. My mother can be. He paused, searching for a polite word. Persuasive. I needed to make sure everything was in order before today. The words came too easily, too fast. Thomas tilted his head slightly. So you did access the file? Yes, but Clara's hand shot to his arm. Evan, she hissed under her breath. He ignored her. But only to confirm what we'd already agreed upon. There was no tampering. The associate's pen scratched quickly across the page. Evan heard it too late. His face blanched, realization dawning in real time. Clara turned toward him, her expression draining of color. You what? She whispered. Evan tried to recover, the veneer of control cracking around the edges. Don't twist my words, Clara. You said yourself. I said nothing about breaking into a lawyer's office. Her voice rose before she caught it, glancing toward Thomas and me. I didn't move. I didn't need to. The air was doing the work for me, tightening, folding in on them. Thomas cleared his throat. For the record, he said calmly, you're admitting to accessing the protected file outside of authorized hours? Evan's jaw flexed. I'm saying I verified it. Which resulted in a blank amendment being substituted. Thomas continued, unflinching. Mr. Langford, do you understand the implications? Clara whispered, almost to herself. Oh my God. I finally spoke, voice measured and low. You really should have read the real amendment before you tried to rewrite it, Evan. He looked at me, disbelief, then something close to fear. What are you talking about? I reached into my handbag and withdrew the smaller envelope, sliding it across the table. The sound it made was soft, but final, like a gavel resting after judgment. This, I said, is my copy, notarized, time-stamped, filed under a hidden docket, one your father and I created for contingencies just like this. Thomas opened the envelope delicately, removing the folded document within. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly as he read the first lines. Mrs. Langford, he said, glancing up, is this the same clause your husband dictated to me 15 years ago? It is. He nodded once, then began reading aloud. Any heir or beneficiary who attempts to alter, remove, or manipulate the estate structure, whether by coercion or forgery, shall be immediately disqualified from all inheritance rights, assets, and trusts, effective upon verification of misconduct. Each syllable landed like a hammer on marble. Evan sank back in his chair. Clara's hand slipped from his arm as though the contact itself was poison. Thomas set the paper down carefully. Given the admission we just heard, I'll be required to submit this to the probate court by end of day. Evan's voice broke through the silence, brittle and desperate. You can't be serious. That clause can't. She planted this. Thomas didn't look up. Mr. Langford, it was recorded and notarized 15 years ago. Your father's signature is right here. The legal trail is airtight. Clara's lips moved, but no sound came. I took a sip of water. Steady. Quiet. You said you wanted to lead, Evan. Congratulations. You just led yourself out. The clock ticked twice before anyone breathed. Then Thomas closed the folder, his tone almost sympathetic. The law will do the rest. Evan turned toward me, eyes wide, voice shaking. You'd really destroy your own son over money? I met his gaze, calm as stone. No, Evan. Over betrayal. The room went utterly still. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, listening. And as the echo of that single word faded, I saw it in his face. The exact moment he realized the war he started wasn't over money at all. It was over legacy. And he'd already lost. For a moment, no one moved. The rain outside beat steady against the windows, the rhythmic tap a metronome for collapse. Then, without warning, Evan's hand slammed down on the mahogany table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. "You tricked me!" he shouted. The veins in his neck stood out like cords. His face flushed deep red. The composed executive facade burning away to reveal the furious, frightened child underneath. I didn't flinch. "You tricked yourself," I said evenly. Clara recoiled, her chair scraping across the floor. "This can't be legal," she spat, her voice thin with panic. "You can't just—" Thomas interrupted, tone clipped but calm. "It's airtight, Mrs. Langford. Every amendment, every notarization, every timestamp, there's no ambiguity." Evan turned on him. "You're supposed to be our lawyer." Thomas met his glare without a flicker of apology. "No, Mr. Langford. I'm the estate's lawyer. There's a difference." Evan's breath came fast now, uneven, his fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white. "This is insane. She set me up." I tilted my head slightly. "If I had, Evan, it would have required your cooperation." "You provided that all by yourself." Clara stood abruptly, crossing her arms. "You knew exactly what you were doing," she said to me, voice shaking. "You've been planning this for months. Years, maybe." I met her gaze. "Planning requires patience, something you and my son never learned." She scoffed. "You think anyone's going to believe this? We'll contest it." "You can try," Thomas said, "but the record will show you tampered with protected property and forged legal documents. The court doesn't take kindly to that." Evan swung toward the door as if to escape, then stopped short. His reflection glared back at him from the glass wall. A man stripped bare. "What happens now?" he demanded. "You think you win? You think you get to walk out of here and—" "Evan," I cut in, quiet but sharp. "Don't finish that sentence. You'll regret the sound of it." He froze. The silence that followed was heavier than anger. It was the sound of defeat realizing itself. Thomas gathered the documents into the folder, his movements precise. "The necessary reports will be filed immediately," he said. "Probate court will likely request statements. Until then, I recommend all parties maintain professionalism." Clara let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Professionalism? You just watched her ruin our lives." Thomas didn't respond. His loyalty was to the paper, not the people. Outside the closed door, muffled voices echoed, receptionists, secretaries, and the unmistakable click of cameras. Someone had tipped off the press. Nina had warned me that the reporters were circling downstairs, waiting for a headline. They would get one. Evan paced like a trapped animal. "We'll fix this. There's always a way to fix it." I rose slowly, smoothing the front of my blazer. "Not this time." He stopped pacing. "Mother, don't—" "You wanted me out," I said quietly. "Consider yourselves out instead." The words landed with surgical precision, not shouted, not cruel, simply true. Clara's eyes darted between us, panic now fully visible beneath her practiced calm. "Evan, do something." He looked at her, then at me, realization dawning like a bad sunrise. "You were never out," he said softly, voice trembling. "You were waiting." I gave a small, sad smile. I was surviving. I gathered my things, the handbag, the notepad I hadn't needed, the pen I'd used only to steady my hand. Then I turned to Thomas. "You'll forward me the court's schedule." He nodded. "Of course, Mrs. Langford." As I walked toward the door, Clara hissed, "You'll die alone in that big house of yours." I paused only long enough to glance over my shoulder. Better alone than surrounded by thieves. The cameras caught the moment I stepped into the hallway. The door swinging open, Evan's voice erupting behind me, raw and furious. "You think this is over?" he shouted. But the microphones outside the conference room caught my reply instead. Quiet, almost serene. "It's already over." Flashes erupted. Questions flew. Someone called my name. Another shouted for comment. I didn't break stride. The sound of it all blurred into something distant, almost musical. By the time the elevator doors closed, the chaos was still spilling from the conference room, the muffled shouts, the metallic crash of something breaking. Thomas's voice rose faintly over the din, firm and final. Meeting adjourned. The elevator descended. My reflection in the mirrored wall looked unfamiliar, calm, colder, freer. Outside, the rain had stopped. And for the first time in years, I realized I could breathe without waiting for permission. The sun had returned to Dallas by afternoon, bright and unforgiving. The kind of light that exposed everything you'd rather keep hidden. By then, the morning storm had already rewritten my name into headlines. Langford matriarch, flips inheritance scandal, son accused of estate tampering. And beneath it all, my face, poised, expression unreadable, caught mid-step leaving Reed and Associates. By the time I reached Thomas's office again, the building's security guard greeted me with a nervous nod. I smiled, polite but distant. I knew what the look meant. Respect, laced with fear. Thomas was waiting inside, jacket off, tie loosened, eyes tired. He stood as I entered, closing the blinds against the glare. "You've had quite a morning," he said. "I've had worse." I set my handbag down, the weight of it lighter now that it carried no secrets. He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." I did. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply studied the documents on his desk. New papers, stamped and fresh from the county office. Then he looked up. "You know," he began carefully, "you now control the full 77 million. The number hung between us like smoke. I leaned back, crossing my legs. "Not for long." He blinked. "I'm sorry?" I slid a single folder toward him, prepared days ago, waiting for this very moment. Inside were transfer directives, drafted in my name and notarized that morning. "I want 50 million of it transferred immediately," I said, "to the Langford Foundation." Thomas frowned. Maggie, that's more than half. Are you sure?" "I'm certain." He flipped through the paperwork, scanning the signatures. "A nonprofit for widows of business owners," he read aloud. "You've already registered it." "I filed the paperwork the week Evan announced I was out," I said. Seemed appropriate to turn exclusion into inclusion. He gave a slow, disbelieving shake of his head. "You never do anything halfway." "I built a company that forgot its conscience," I said quietly. "Maybe it's time to build something that remembers it." Thomas leaned back, studying me. "You realize how this will look. To the press? To your son?" "Like a message," I interrupted. "Good. That's exactly what it is." By the time I left his office, the transfers were already in motion. Numbers moved faster than apologies ever could. Within an hour, the Foundation's account was live, its board named, its mission statement printed in every major outlet. When the headlines updated, they were less cruel this time. Langford matriarch launches $50 million fund for widows. The Iron Widow strikes again. This time, with compassion. I watched the coverage from the quiet of my study, sunlight spilling across the polished desk. Nina sat beside me, eyes wide as she scrolled through social media. "They're calling you a hero," she said. "Even the financial networks are impressed. The donations are already rolling in." I smiled faintly. "Heroes are just people who weaponize regret." She looked at me. "And Evan?" The answer came before I could speak. A headline alert flashing across her screen. "Sources close to the Langford family confirm. Evan Langford removed from corporate board amid legal review." "He found out," she murmured. I took a slow breath. Good. Across town, in a house that used to be mine, Evan sat on the edge of his bed, phone in hand. The morning's fury burned down to ashes. Clara stood near the window, reading aloud from her tablet. "She's using our money for strangers," she hissed, her voice thin, brittle. Half of it. She's giving it away. Evan didn't look up. His phone glowed with the same headline. My name, my foundation, my choice. It was never ours, he said quietly. Clara turned toward him, incredulous. What do you mean, never ours? You fought for this. He finally looked up, eyes hollow. No, he said. I fought her. That's not the same thing. Outside their window, reporters were gathering at the gate again, lenses glinting in the sun like weapons. Inside, the silence stretched between them like a verdict. Back in my study, Nina reached for the remote. Do you want me to turn it off? No, I said. Let them talk. It's the first time they've said my name without his shadow on it. The screen showed my photo again, the one from the courthouse steps. Calm, unbothered, decisive. But I wasn't thinking about cameras. I was thinking about the women who would soon walk into the foundation's office. Tired faces, careful smiles, lives rebuilt from loss. Women who'd understand the kind of silence that comes before starting over. Send the press statement, I said finally. Nina nodded, her voice soft. Under what headline? I met her eyes. Make it simple. She smiled faintly. What do you want it to say? Legacy restored, I said. That should do. Outside, the sun shifted, throwing the room into golden light. Somewhere across town, my son was learning the hardest truth of all. That power, once surrendered to greed, never really returns. And as I watched my name scroll across the ticker one last time, I felt no triumph, only release. By midweek, the Langford mansion had started to sound like an empty museum. Echoes without visitors, chandeliers glittering for no one. The house that once hosted senators and socialites now hummed with lawyers' phone calls and the rustle of moving boxes. Evan and Clara barely spoke except to accuse. From the moment the board froze the family's accounts, they'd begun circling each other like rival defendants, both convinced the other had loaded the gun. You told me to do it, Evan shouted one night, pacing across the marble foyer as rain streaked the windows. I told you to be careful, Clara snapped, arms folded tight. You were the one who broke into that office. You wanted me to, he barked back. You pushed me to take control. She laughed, sharp and humorless. Control? You couldn't even control your mother. She played you like an amateur. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. Evan looked at her, really looked, and for the first time saw what she was. Not an accomplice, but an opportunist already calculating her next escape route. The phone on the table buzzed with another notification. Langford Estate Investigation expands to corporate board. He ignored it. By the next morning, half the staff was gone. Cars that once lined the circular drive disappeared one by one. The mansion's brightness dimmed under a film of dust and denial. Across town, I read none of the coverage. I refused every interview request. Nina handled the reporters like a bouncer at a velvet rope, polite, firm, immovable. Mrs. Langford declines to comment, she said on repeat until the words became their own kind of punctuation. Thomas stopped by that Thursday, bringing fresh updates and a bottle of scotch he claimed was celebratory. I didn't drink any more, but I poured him a glass out of courtesy. The board's finished the audit, he said. Your son's been officially removed pending investigation. Clara's personal accounts are frozen under suspicion of financial collusion. Good, I said simply. He eyed me over the rim of his glass. You're very calm about all this. What's left to say? Nina, who'd been sorting correspondence nearby, turned toward me. Aren't you angry? I looked up from the foundation ledger I'd been reviewing. Anger's loud, I said. Revenge is quiet paperwork. Thomas nearly choked on his drink, laughing softly. You're terrifying. Efficient, I corrected. He smiled. Same thing. The truth was, I hadn't felt anger for days. Not since the morning Evan's name came off the board and mine went back on the headlines, attached this time to purpose instead of scandal. The fury had burned itself clean, leaving only a strange calm behind. Outside, the world had begun to move on. Reporters found new obsessions. Markets steadied. Donors kept calling, eager to align themselves with my foundation's moral glow. But inside the Langford mansion, the rot kept spreading. Clara began sleeping in the guest room. Her jewelry disappeared from the safe one afternoon. Pawned or hidden, Evan didn't ask which. He spent his days on the phone, promising investors he'd fix things, as if sincerity could unwrite a clause. At night, he sat alone in his father's old study, staring at the oil portrait above the fireplace, the one of my husband with that politician's grin and a hand resting on his son's shoulder. I imagined Evan wondering, maybe for the first time, what that hand had really meant. By Friday, Clara was gone, her closet half empty, her car missing, her number disconnected. Evan called me once, left a voicemail he probably regretted immediately afterward. "You got what you wanted, Mom. Hope it was worth it." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that he'd understand. Instead, I walked the quiet halls of my own house, a smaller place now, humbler, quieter. I passed framed photos I hadn't taken down yet. Evan as a boy, flower on his cheeks, laughing at something that must have been funny once. I touched the edge of the frame. "It was worth it," I whispered, though whether I was convincing him or myself, I couldn't tell. That night, Nina brought in the final draft of the Foundation's quarterly plan. She set it on my desk. "It's all here," she said. "Everything you wanted." I signed the papers, the pen steady in my hand. As I finished, thunder rolled far off over the horizon, a slow, distant echo of the storm that had started it all. Thomas, still nursing the last of his scotch, looked out the window and said, "You know, Maggie, they'll write about this someday." "They'll try," I said, "but they'll get one thing wrong." "What's that?" I glanced at the stack of finalized documents, each bearing my name. "They'll think it was about money." He nodded, smiling faintly. "And it wasn't?" I met his eyes. "No. It was about who gets to keep their soul." He raised his glass in quiet salute. "Then you're wealthier than all of them." Outside, the lightning flashed again, white and brief, like the flicker of a camera shutter. And for the first time, I realized the story wasn't ending. It was merely entering syndication. The story broke on a Thursday morning, the kind that starts ordinary and ends in ruin. By 9 a.m., the business channels were running split-screen coverage, one half showing me walking into a charity board meeting, the other flashing the headline in red. "Langford heir under formal investigation. Estate file. Tampering confirmed." The footage looped endlessly, Evan's face, pale and tight, ducking through a crowd of reporters as microphones lunged like spears. His name, once synonymous with family prestige, now ran beneath the words fraud, conspiracy, and malfeasance. Thomas had warned me this would happen fast. Corporate gossip traveled quicker than truth. By noon, the board of Langford Holdings issued their statement. Effective immediately, Evan Langford is relieved of all duties pending legal outcome. No sentiment, no grace, just a surgical dismissal. I watched it from the Foundation office, coffee in hand. Nina muted the television halfway through. "You don't have to watch this," she said softly. "I do," I replied. "People should see what greed looks like when it runs out of places to hide." Across the ticker, a new headline appeared. Clara Langford dropped from major brand contracts. The photographs told their own story. Clara leaving a boutique, sunglasses on, mouth pressed into a perfect, furious line. The same blogs that once worshipped her wardrobe now dissected her downfall. Influencer no more, Nina murmured. They're all distancing. They were never close, I said. They were just orbiting the money. The phone rang for the 7th time that hour. Press, donors, old acquaintances suddenly interested in moral proximity. Nina silenced it. You really don't want to issue a statement? She asked. You could define the narrative. I smiled faintly. Integrity doesn't need a press release. She stared at me for a beat, then nodded. You know, that's going to end up on a mug. Then make sure it's dishwasher safe. That afternoon, Thomas stopped by with a stack of updates. Legal filings, court confirmations, the kind of paperwork that looked clinical until you realized it marked the death of reputations. He placed the stack on my desk with care. It's all moving as expected, he said. Your son's assets are frozen pending review. Clara's social accounts are in lockdown. The board has already voted to restructure the firm without them. I closed the file gently. And the clause? Enforced, airtight, he said. Even if they appeal, it won't change the outcome. You're untouchable. That word, untouchable, hung in the air a moment too long. I glanced at him. I'm not sure that's the compliment it used to be. He smiled, weary. Maybe not, but it's the truth. When he left, Nina turned her laptop toward me. You've gone viral. I frowned. For what this time? She hit play. It was a montage of news clips, voiceovers, and grainy footage from courthouse steps. My image, calm, composed, walking away from chaos, set to triumphant music. A caption faded across the screen, "The Iron Widow." I laughed before I could stop myself, a dry, incredulous sound. Good God, they've branded me. Nina grinned. You're trending worldwide. Hashtags, think pieces, podcasts. Half the internet wants to interview you. The other half wants to be you. Poor half, I murmured. Outside the window, the Dallas skyline shimmered in late afternoon light. I could see my reflection faintly in the glass. Not the Iron Widow, not the billionaire matriarch. Just a woman who had outlived every version of herself others had tried to invent. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was defending something. I was simply existing, unassailable. Meanwhile, across the city, Evan was vanishing. The same cameras that had once followed him through red carpet galas now caught him leaving side doors and service entrances. His eyes darted like a hunted man's. He hadn't been seen at the company offices in days. Rumors said he'd fired his PR team, then his lawyers. Clara, ever the survivor, was already feeding quotes to glossy magazines. I was misled. I never knew. Her performance was flawless, but no one bought tickets this time. By dusk, the internet had moved from mockery to mythology. They weren't just reporting anymore. They were romanticizing. The woman who built the empire, the son who tried to steal it, and the widow who didn't blink. Nina watched the feeds as comments poured in. They're calling you Justice in heels, she said. I smiled faintly. They'll forget by next week. Maybe, she said, but not entirely. As evening settled, the phones finally stopped ringing. I turned off the lights in the office, leaving only the city glow through the windows. For a long time, I just stood there, watching the reflection of downtown lights ripple across the glass. Somewhere out there, my son was hiding from headlines. I was standing inside one. Thomas's words echoed back from earlier in the week. They'll write about this someday. He was right. But they already had. I picked up my coat, slipped my phone into my bag, and whispered to no one. Let them. The lock clicked behind me, and as I stepped into the night, the city seemed quieter, as if even it knew which Langford was still standing. The city lights bled through my curtains like restless thoughts that refused to fade. Dallas never really slept. It just dimmed its noise. waiting for someone to listen. I sat in the dark, still in the same clothes I'd worn to the office. The foundation paperwork lay open on the table beside an untouched cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. The silence pressed heavy on my ribs, almost kind. For the first time in weeks, there were no calls, no reporters, no statements to approve. Just me, and the quiet that followed victory. It wasn't triumph that filled the room. It was something closer to grief. The clock ticked toward midnight. Outside, rain threatened but didn't arrive. The storm held its breath, mirroring mine. When the tears came, they weren't dramatic. They didn't choke or heave. They slipped down slowly like they'd been waiting for permission. I pressed my hand against my mouth, stifling a sound that wasn't quite sobbing, wasn't quite laughter. My reflection in the window was unfamiliar. Strong, yes, but tired in ways strength doesn't fix. For a long time, I just sat there, watching the faint shimmer of the skyline and the ghost of my own face superimposed over it. The Iron Widow, they called me. They'd never seen the rust underneath. My eyes drifted to the framed photograph on the nearby shelf. Evan as a boy, no older than 7, holding a kite we'd made from wrapping paper and string. His smile had been missing teeth, his cheeks sunburned from too much Texas summer. He'd looked back at me that day and said, "I'll fly higher than anyone." And he had. Until he forgot who tied the string. I stood and crossed the room, pulling another frame from the wall, a photo from my husband's funeral. Black suits, black umbrellas, white roses against gray sky. Evan had clung to my hand so tightly my fingers went numb. His voice had cracked when he whispered, "You were supposed to protect the family." I told him I would. I traced that photo's edge now, feeling the faint tremor of memory run through my fingertips. "You were supposed to protect the family," I whispered again, this time to the woman in the glass. The answer came from the doorway, soft but steady. "You did." Nina stood there, barefoot, wrapped in a cardigan too big for her. Her expression was unreadable, sympathy without pity, understanding without intrusion. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You did protect the family, just not the way they expected." I smiled, small and tired. Maybe that's enough. She walked over and sat opposite me, folding her legs beneath her. The air between us was warm with silence. For the first time, she didn't bring a question or a file. She just sat, present, real. After a while, she said quietly, "Do you regret it?" I took a long breath, letting it out slowly. "No," I said, "but I mourn it." She nodded. "That's fair." We sat like that for a while, listening to the house, the creak of settling wood, the hum of distant traffic. A life that had been built on noise was finally allowed to exhale. I looked around. The shelves lined with old ledgers, the polished desk, the faint trace of perfume still clinging to the drapes. Every inch of this house had once felt like a battlefield. Tonight, it felt like neutral ground. The storm finally began, soft rain whispering against the windows. I closed my eyes and let the sound wash over me. Justice doesn't always sound like applause. Sometimes, it sounds like rain after a long drought. Quiet, cleansing, indifferent. When I opened my eyes again, Nina had fallen asleep in the armchair across from me, her head tilted slightly, a pen still in her hand. I stood, pulled a blanket from the couch, and draped it over her shoulders. Then I turned back to the window. Dallas glowed faintly under the drizzle, the city of beginnings and endings. For the first time since it all began, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next move. The game was over. And yet, deep in the quiet, I could feel something new taking shape. Not revenge, not loss, but the hollow, hopeful space that comes after both. I exhaled once, softly. Maybe that's enough, I whispered again. The rain kept falling, gentle and relentless, a lullaby for what was finally, mercifully finished. A week later, the house had settled into an unfamiliar kind of stillness, not the silence of grief, but the calm that follows the last echo of a storm. Even the air felt different. The rain had washed away the dust, the noise, the residue of betrayal. I'd been reading in the library, not the news, not financial reports, just a novel that had sat unopened for years, when the knock came. 3 steady raps. Thomas Reed never needed to announce himself. I opened the door to find him standing under the porch's shadow, hat in hand, expression grave but softened by something almost gentle. "Afternoon, Maggie," he said. "Mind if I come in?" "Of course not." He stepped inside, the old floorboards creaking under his weight. "Didn't want to call," he said, setting his briefcase on the console. "Some things are better said face to face. Bad news or unfinished business?" He gave a tired smile. "A little of both." We walked to the sitting room. The fire was low but steady. He took his usual chair, the same one he'd sat in during every major conversation of my life since I was 35, the one reserved for truths. "There's one more thing," he said finally. "Your husband left a sealed folder. It was filed separately, under a personal instruction note I'd nearly forgotten about." My breath stilled. "Filed where?" "Locked in a private drawer, beneath the amendment records," he said. "It's labeled for Margaret only." He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a flat, leather-bound folder, yellowed with time and tied shut with a faded navy ribbon. My husband's handwriting, bold, slanted, unmistakable, stretched across the top. Thomas set it gently in my lap. "I didn't open it, but after everything that's happened, I think he'd want you to." For a long time, I didn't move. My fingers hovered over the ribbon like it was something alive. When I finally untied it, the knot slipped apart too easily, as if it had been waiting years to come undone. Inside was a single envelope and a small stack of documents. The envelope bore my name, Margaret Langford, in my husband's hand. The letter inside was short, written in blue ink that had faded at the edges but still carried his voice. "Maggie, if you're reading this, it means one of two things. I've been right about Evan, or you've forgiven him enough that you'll never need this. Either way, I couldn't leave you without one last safeguard. You always said legacy should mean something earned, not inherited. So this is yours. Earned, not given. Below are the plans for a secondary trust, under your name only. Untouched, undisclosed, untraceable by anyone but Thomas. Value at the time of creation, 12 million. By now, likely much more. You built our fortune. I built this to make sure you'd never have to fight for it again. I knew our son might forget the difference between privilege and power. You never did. That's why this belongs to you, and to no one else. Consider it my last apology, and my final word. H." The letter trembled slightly in my hands. For a moment, the room seemed to narrow around me. Just paper, memory, and breath. Thomas cleared his throat softly. "There's documentation here," he said, gesturing to the folder. "Blueprints to the trust account. Untouched for 21 years. I've already confirmed its validity." I nodded slowly, still staring at the letter. My husband's penmanship carried its own weight. Precise, deliberate, full of the steadiness he'd lost toward the end. $12 million. A number that once might have startled me. Now it felt like punctuation, the last line of a story that had already been written. "He knew," I said quietly. Thomas tilted his head. "About Evan?" "About everything," I whispered. He knew I'd need one last word. A small, involuntary laugh escaped me, not joyful, but human. Tears blurred the ink until the words became watercolor shadows. I folded the letter carefully, pressed it once to my lips, then stood. Thomas rose with me. "What will you do with it?" I crossed to the fireplace. The embers pulsed faintly, waiting. What I should have done years ago. He watched as I laid the letter onto the flames. The paper curled instantly, edges glowing orange before turning to gray. The ink vanished first, as if secrets were the easiest part to burn. For a long while neither of us spoke. Only the fire made a sound, a soft hiss, a whisper of closure. When it was done, I turned back to him. "Tell the bank to keep it where it is. I don't need it." Thomas studied me, then nodded. "You sure?" "I have enough," I said. "Money isn't the inheritance that matters." He smiled faintly. "Then what is?" I looked into the fire, knowing when to let go. Outside, wind swept across the lawn, carrying the faint scent of rain. Thomas gathered his things, pausing at the doorway. "He'd be proud of you, Maggie." I didn't answer. Pride had never been the goal. After he left, I stood alone before the hearth. The last of the ashes drifted upward, catching the light. Pieces of ink, paper, and apology, dissolving into smoke. And for the first time since my husband's death, I whispered into the stillness, "Goodbye." The flames crackled once more, like an acknowledgement. Closure, literal and final. By spring, Dallas bloomed again. Pale blue mornings and magnolia afternoons, the kind of beauty that doesn't apologize for what came before. The Langford Foundation had become a quiet empire of good. Scholarships, housing grants, small business loans for women who'd once been left behind by the men they built everything for. I watched it grow the way you watch a garden take shape after a storm. Still cautious, still expecting frost, but proud all the same. Nina managed operations now. Her once shy efficiency transformed into quiet authority. She moved through the offices with the ease of someone who had earned her power, not inherited it. The board loved her. The staff trusted her. She'd become the kind of woman I once wished I'd had beside me when I was young. Most days I worked from home, a smaller sunlit study overlooking the garden. My desk faced the window, where vines had begun to climb the brick, reaching toward the light. The air smelled of rain and paper and peace. Peace, I'd learned, is rarely loud. The world had already moved on. The headlines that once tore us apart had faded to footnotes in business journals. Evan's name appeared only in legal filings now, muted, procedural, irrelevant. Sometimes I caught myself almost missing the noise. The chaos had given me purpose. The quiet demanded something harder. Acceptance. That afternoon, Nina came in with a stack of letters. Donor acknowledgments, event invitations, a few thank you notes handwritten in careful cursive. "All signed," she said, setting them down. "We're ahead of schedule for once." I smiled. "I should have hired you years ago." "You did," she said. "Just not officially." Her phone buzzed. She glanced down, frowning slightly. "It's a restricted number," she said. "Want me to—" Before she could finish, I held out my hand. "I'll take it." She hesitated, then handed me the phone and stepped out, closing the door behind her. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end, then a voice I hadn't heard in months, raw, stripped of its old bravado. "Mom?" I didn't say anything. He took a shaky breath. "I didn't mean—" My heart, traitorous thing, stuttered once. But my voice came steady. "You meant every word, Evan." He tried again. I didn't know what I was doing. Clara's gone. The lawyers. They're saying I could. That's why it worked," I said quietly. "What?" "The plan," I said. "It worked because you meant it. Every selfish word, every cruel gesture. If you'd been pretending, I might have forgiven you." There was a sound on the other end, the small broken noise of someone realizing too late what truth costs. Then nothing. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment before pressing delete contact. The number vanished. A simple act, almost trivial, but heavier than it looked. For years, I'd fought to keep my family from unraveling. Now I was learning how to live with the threads left behind. I placed the phone face down on the desk and looked out the window. The vines had reached the second floor. Sunlight glinted off the glass, turning everything gold. The past, I realized, had gone quiet. Not gone, but at rest. Later that week, the foundation hosted its first anniversary gala. I watched from the back of the ballroom as Nina stood on stage, announcing new programs, new partnerships, a new direction that didn't require my approval. Applause filled the room, bright, sincere, echoing against crystal and velvet. When it was my turn to speak, I simply said, "Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what keeps growing when you finally step aside." The audience stood, cameras flashed, but it felt different this time. Not attention, not validation, just acknowledgement. Afterward, as the crowd filtered out, Thomas found me near the exit, hands in his pockets, eyes soft with something close to pride. "Looks like you built your second empire," he said. I smiled. "No. This time, I just planted it." Outside, the night was cool and clean. The streets glowed with reflected light, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, faint, familiar, no longer threatening. I walked toward the car, the sound of laughter and music fading behind me. For the first time in a long time, there was no war left to fight, no claws to trigger, no mask to wear. Just a woman, her work, and the echo of everything she'd let burn. And as I opened the car door, I caught my reflection in the window. Older, steadier, free. The past didn't follow. It finally stayed where it belonged. 1 year later, Dallas shimmered beneath a velvet sky. City lights polished like glass. Cameras flashing in the crisp spring air. The Langford Foundation's second annual gala was the event of the season. Not because of the money, but because of the myth. They'd called it the Night of Renewal, a name I hadn't chosen but didn't correct. Let the city have its poetry. I had mine. The red carpet stretched across the marble steps of the Winslow Center downtown. Reporters lined both sides, microphones raised like spears of curiosity. They'd expected spectacle. I gave them composure. I stepped out of the car to a hum of shutters, the sound now more ritual than intrusion. My gown was navy silk, understated, elegant. My diamonds were borrowed, my calm not. As I walked up the steps, a reporter called out, "Mrs. Langford, is it true your son's broke?" The air stilled for a beat, an unkind question wrapped in false concern. I paused just long enough to let the cameras focus, then smiled. "No comment," I said gently. "I'm just grateful my investments grew where love failed." A murmur rippled through the crowd, half gasp, half admiration. The flashbulbs popped faster, hungry for something I no longer had to give. Inside, the ballroom gleamed with silver light. The air smelled of champagne and magnolias. The banners read, "Langford Foundation, 1 year of restoring dignity." I could see Nina at the registration table, her black gown sleek, her hair swept up. She moved through donors and dignitaries with the calm confidence of someone born for this world, or rebuilt for it. She caught my eye and nodded once, the same way she had that morning a year ago when everything had started to turn. Thomas was there too, posted near the bar, tie slightly askew, watching the room with the quiet pride of a man who'd seen history cleaned up with paperwork. He raised his glass toward me, a silent toast. When it was time for my speech, I walked to the podium under the wash of stage light. The crowd quieted, 400 people waiting to hear how triumph sounds when it's been earned. The teleprompter glowed, but I didn't need it. "Good evening," I began. "A year ago, this foundation was just an idea, a promise made in the shadow of loss. I thought I was rebuilding something that had fallen apart. I was wrong." I let the pause breathe. The room leaned closer. "I wasn't rebuilding," I said softly. "I was redefining." I looked out at the faces: investors, widows, scholars, women who'd rebuilt homes and businesses with the grants we'd given. Some were crying. Most were simply listening, the way people do when truth sounds unfamiliar. "We build legacies not with heirs," I said, "but with honor. We pass down not our wealth, but our will, to stand again when everything we trusted falls." Applause swelled slowly, like a tide coming in. For a moment, I let myself feel it. Not pride, exactly, but release. Every decision, every sacrifice, every sleepless night had led here, to this quiet absolution dressed as celebration. The applause grew louder, echoing off marble and glass, and for a heartbeat I imagined the sound traveling further, through the city, past the darkened mansion that once bore my name, into the silence where my son now lived. Thomas met my eyes across the room. He nodded, approving but solemn. He knew this wasn't just a speech, it was a benediction. I stepped away from the microphone as the orchestra swelled behind me, the strings carrying the moment like air. Outside, the reporters were still waiting. When I emerged, they surged forward again, hungry for quotes and closure. "Mrs. Langford?" one shouted. "Any final thoughts on your legacy?" I stopped on the final step, the city's glow reflected in every lens, and smiled, the kind of smile that comes only after surviving yourself. "He told me I was out of the 77 million, I said quietly. A flash went off, white, blinding. I looked directly into it. "Turns out," I added, "I was the only one ever in." The crowd erupted, the words rippling outward. A headline already forming before the sound even faded. I turned away from the cameras, descending the steps into the waiting car. Behind me, applause still echoed from inside the ballroom, soft, rhythmic, almost like forgiveness. The door closed, and as the driver pulled into the quiet Dallas night, I finally exhaled, the last breath of a story that had burned, rebuilt, and, at last, endured. The Langford name would live on, but this time, it belonged to me.